Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this GameTech.com video we're going to be discussing two pertinent pieces of news. The first would be Project Scorpio. More specifically, Phil Spencer has given some hints regarding how Microsoft are going to be tackling the performance of the machine. And then we're going to be rounding off the GeForce GTX 1050 and 1050 Ti pre-launch coverage, because finally Nvidia have formally announced the cards, and therefore we have benchmarks from Nvidia themselves. So naturally, if you want to take that with a grain of salt, feel free. And we also have official pricing and lots of images and that type of thing. But first things first, let's talk about the Scorpio. I don't think it requires me to tell you, but the Scorpio is the high-performance version of the Xbox One. This naturally means it will play all of the Xbox One games, but the hardware will be considerably more powerful, and therefore you're going to be able to run at higher resolutions or with better graphics, higher frame rates, and so on and so on. It's going to be available holiday 2017, which naturally means that Sony have quite an advantage in terms of release schedule with their PlayStation 4 Pro. But Phil Spencer has recently conducted an interview with the Japanese weekly Famitsu magazine, and these comments were translated by DualShockers. Phil Spencer has said that he does believe that there is a difference between the PS4 Pro and the Xbox Scorpio. He begins by saying that the console itself, when describing the performance of it, isn't really a number. I do think this is kind of amusing given the 6 T-flops number that's been bandied about by Microsoft for the past couple of months, but still, let's continue to roll with it for a moment. According to him, the development team used the keyword for the creation of Project Scorpio constantly, and one keyword was balance. Now, the idea here, of course, is the balance between the CPU, memory, and the GPU. And he went on to describe the performance of Project Scorpio with 6 teraflops as easy, but he does recognize that for developers it's not really about just a number. The main point of Scorpio is that the actual hardware itself is balanced, and therefore he believes that games on Scorpio will run differently from what we've seen this year. Now, that's actually a rather interesting quote, or rather a analysis of a quote, because obviously it's a translation. But if you read between the lines, it does tell you that the PS4's Pro's GPU and CPU are out of balance. If you were to look at the PS4 Pro's CPU, it's running at just 2.1 gigahertz, whereas the GPU is running at, or putting out 4.2 T-flops of performance. So there's a good probability that Scorpio is going to have a faster CPU as well. Now, I have done a lot of analysis on the Scorpio. The idea of a lower clocked Jaguar, in other words, a clocked Jaguar of around 2 gigahertz to 2.2 gigahertz, is not going to be the selection that Microsoft are going to be choosing. So it's either we're going to see the Puma, which is essentially a slightly advanced version of Jaguar, or we're going to see a very, very highly clocked Jaguar, maybe on a 14nm process, or potentially a different CPU entirely. Now, what that selection is going to be, I don't know. It could be based upon excavator architecture. We don't really know. All they've said is it's 8 cores, which means absolutely bupkis in the grand scheme of things. They've just said it's an 8-core CPU, and ironically, we actually have a lot more information on memory and the GPU than what we do the CPU. And I say this as ironically because with the Xbox One, the original Xbox I refer, the Xbox One's CPU was actually the best part of it. It had a 1.75 gigahertz clock speed, and it actually was faster than the PS4, and that's why some games on the PS4 actually ran slower. Basically, one can make the argument that, especially early in the Xbox One's life, the API, which was a variant of DirectX, was a little bit more of a strain on the CPU, but as Microsoft released different revisions, the API became less of an overhead and become a lot more to the metal, and therefore the CPU was a lot more powerful. Well, not more powerful, but they were able to squeeze more out of it. So Sony have been somewhat criticised for the 2.1 GHz clock speed, and this is going outside the remit somewhat of this video, but some developers have already said that, hey, the reason that we're saying that we can't guarantee 60 frames a second on certain games, at 1080p especially, is because the CPU is essentially holding us back. It's CPU bound. And that, for those of you who do not know, simply means that the CPU cannot send instructions to the GPU fast enough for the GPU to draw an additional frame of animation. In other words, the convoy can sail only as fast as the slowest ship. So in a GPU-bound scenario, it's different. The CPU is the thing that's the faster one, and the GPU cannot keep up by drawing as much detail or as many frames as possible. On the other hand, if it's the reverse and it's CPU-bound, the CPU is trying to send data to the GPU, but it can't keep up. And so, essentially, the GPU is just waiting around between frames, and often it's just idle. So you have maybe bubbles in the pipeline where, quite literally, the GPU is just like la 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 la, waiting for data, and it's a bit of a problem. We also, most likely, are going to have an additional amount of memory. Now, I've discussed this at length before, and I don't want to go into a whole analysis of the Xbox Scorpio in this video. As I said, I've done a couple of them previously. You can search for them on the channel. But it looks like 320-bit memory bus and 12 gigabytes of RAM is definitely what Scorpio is going to be featuring. And so this is pretty important, because theoretically it means that this system shouldn't really have a major issue. Now, that's not to say that it's going to be able to run all games at 4K at 60 FPS, no issues with multiple anti-aliasing. No, obviously the system is going to have weaknesses, and certain games are going to push it to its limit, but it won't have a weaker component. That's if you take these comments from Phil Spencer at face value. Anyway, let's move over to the GeForce GTX 1050 lineup, shall we? So, as promised, the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti and GeForce GTX 1050, have both been unveiled by Nvidia, and as I mentioned just yesterday, the release date is indeed going to be the 25th of October. That's this year, 2016. Now, these cards are actually well priced, at least in my opinion, given the level of performance that we're looking at. Considering that these cards are going to be priced at just $109 for the GeForce GTX 1050 and $139 for the 1050 Ti, and once again considering that these cards are going to slightly outperform the GTX 960, it's easy to see that these cards are definitely going to have a very, very, very loyal fan base indeed. Now, just to quickly blast through the specifications, because we've done the whole specification breakdown a couple of times before, so I don't want to retread too much old ground. The 1050 is running at 640 CUDA cores, whereas the 1050 Ti has 768 CUDA cores. Now, if we were to start doing a bit of analysis on this, 768 CUDA cores means you're looking at 48 TMUs and 32 ROPs, with a core clock of around 1300 MHz, and it boosts to around 1400 MHz. I say around because obviously manufacturers could go a little bit higher or a little bit lower depending, but the Nvidia recommended speeds are 1318 and 1392 respectively, which is not shabby. It's about 250 MHz over GM107, and that's largely the reason that you're looking at the performance increases over the older architecture. I'm not going to go through all of the performance details of the card in terms of the benchmarks, because quite frankly I'll be here until Christmas, and besides you can see them visually on screen anyway. But as one can see, the 1050 Ti in particular pretty much ruffle stomps over the original 950, which is to be expected given the architectural leap. But even so, this means that this card is going to be capable of delivering light 1080p gaming. I say light because obviously there are going to be games like Gears of War, which putting at maximum settings is certainly going to be a bit strenuous, But for example, Firestrike Extreme, 3,779 points with the tie, whereas the vanilla 960, 3,349 points. So you're looking at around 10-12% performance increases over the 960, whereas once again the 950 just gets absolutely destroyed and decimated. It's arguable, however, that the card that's losing out the most is the RX 460. Considering that the RX 460 is a little more expensive, I don't really know if it's got a market at this point. Now, I'm actually a big fan of the Polaris lineup, but in my personal opinion, I think that RX 460 is just a bit too expensive for what you get. And with this particular card, I feel that AMD are going to have to do some aggressive price rearranging. I'm just going to say it in those really nice terms. So overall, I think this card is going to be very, very popular with the small form factor crowd. As I've said multiple times over, the fact that this does not require a secondary connector, I wouldn't be surprised if some vendors do really push the 6 pins at the very least for the super overclockable models. But obviously it depends really on how that price starts to shoot up. For example, if the price at that point starts to get a bit too close to the 1060, just for example, or the RX 470, then one can make a very compelling argument that you're better off saving the money. However, just as a final note, this card, I definitely feel is going to have a lot of folks interested in it. You've got a single HDMI, a single DVI, and 3 DisplayPort 1.4s, which is absolutely perfect for either mobile gaming, streaming, or any light usage scenarios at all. And the problem with graphics cards now is that so much power is even in the low-end cards. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this card is going to be comparable, and I'm using rough numbers here, of like the Xbox One/PS4 in terms of visual fidelity. It might even be slightly better in some games, slightly worse in others, but obviously it's rather configurable. It's not shabby. I mean, the 1060, and I do mean the 3GB model, because obviously there's a couple, that's $199 US. So that isn't bad either. So Nvidia and AMD have really started to fix a big problem in the graphics card market, which was around just a couple of months ago, certainly early 2016, and that was that there wasn't really a mid-range card that was in the budget of a lot of individuals. But now that's no longer the case. You're starting to see so many GPUs that are packing in between the 100 to, let's say, $300 US mark, so you can get rather nice performance leaps very quickly. You've got the GeForce GTX 1050, 1050 Ti, 1060, and 1060 6GB models, which are at different price points of 109, 140, 200, and 250. Those are RRPs, and then of course you've got AMD's Polaris lineup. The main issue with Polaris, especially the RX 460 and the 470, is there is a lot of price gouging going on, and that isn't really AMD's fault, it's retailers. So hopefully that they can push that down, even if it's by $20, especially for the RX 470. I do feel it would help to make the GPU industry a lot more compelling. But with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.